By late 1966, the skies over the Red River Delta in North Vietnam had become a deeply frustrating, highly lethal operational theater for the United States Air Force. If you were a pilot sitting in the cockpit of an F-105 Thunderchief bomber during this period, you were trapped in an impossible operational paradox. You were flying one of the most advanced, heavily engineered tactical aircraft on the planet, backed by the undeniable logistical supremacy of the American military apparatus. Yet, every time you crossed into enemy airspace, the statistical probability of your survival was actively undermined by your own command structure. The Department of Defense, operating under rigid political constraints from Washington, had instituted a series of rules of engagement so restrictive that they effectively nullified American technological advantages. Fearful of provoking the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China into a wider regional conflict, civilian leadership placed an invisible, impenetrable dome of protection over the most critical enemy assets. American pilots were strictly forbidden from striking North Vietnamese fighter bases like Phuoc Yen or Gia Lam. An American pilot could be streaking over the Delta at 1,000 kilometers per hour, look down, and visually identify enemy fighters parked out in the open on the concrete aprons. But pulling the trigger was entirely out of the question. Striking an aircraft on the ground violated the political directives. The enemy understood this political hesitation perfectly, and they built an entire aerial doctrine around it. The North Vietnamese Air Force operated a fleet of Soviet-supplied MiG-21 interceptors. By American engineering standards, the MiG-21 was relatively simple, but it was highly effective for its intended purpose. It was a lightweight delta-wing interceptor capable of climbing rapidly to altitude, striking quickly, and diving away. But the true danger of the MiG-21 did not lie solely in its aerodynamics. It was dangerous because of the Soviet-designed command structure that guided it. North Vietnamese pilots did not fly autonomous hunting sweeps. They operated under a rigid ground control intercept, or GCI network. Deep inside underground bunkers, North Vietnamese radar operators stared at sweeping cathode ray screens, fed by an overlapping network of early warning radar arrays scattered across the country. These controllers held absolute authority. They tracked the incoming American formations, calculated the precise altitude, speed, and intercept geometry, and then commanded the MiG-21 pilots exactly when to take off, what heading to fly, and when to fire. Because the American bombers were barred from attacking the bases, the North Vietnamese ground controllers could hold their interceptors on the runway until the mathematics of the engagement were absolutely perfect. If you find this intersection of military engineering, political bureaucracy, and tactical problem-solving fascinating, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so we can continue examining these declassified histories together. For the American F-105 Thunderchief squadrons, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The Thunderchief was originally designed during the Cold War for a very specific, singular mission, flying low and fast across Europe to deliver a tactical nuclear payload. It was built for straight-line speed, not for dogfighting. But over Southeast Asia, the Air Force was forced to use the airframe as a conventional tactical bomber. Loaded down with nearly 3,000 kilograms of external ordnance, heavy fuel tanks, and electronic countermeasures pods, the massive aircraft was operating at the absolute margins of its aerodynamic performance when a formation of fully loaded F-105 bombers approached their targets. They had to fly highly predictable structured routes. They had to navigate through narrow geographical corridors, often referred to by the pilots as Thud Ridge, just to avoid the dense rings of surface-to-air missiles. The North Vietnamese ground controllers watched these sluggish, predictable bomber formations on their radar screens day after day. They learned exactly what an F-105 formation looked like electronically. They knew its radar cross-section. They knew the altitudes it favored. They knew the specific radio frequencies the pilots used. When the ground controllers saw this specific electronic signature, they launched the MiG-21 interceptors. The MiGs would streak up through the cloud cover, fire their heat-seeking missiles or cannons at the lumbering bombers, and dive back to the absolute safety of their untouchable air bases. It was a perfectly executed defensive doctrine. For the F-105 pilots, even surviving the encounter often meant failure. To evade the agile MiGs, the American bombers were forced to immediately jettison their heavy bomb loads into the jungle below to regain their maneuverability, meaning the primary strike mission was completely neutralized before they ever reached the target area. By the autumn of 1966, the American bomber fleets were experiencing mounting operational losses, and a deep institutional frustration was taking root at the Pentagon. Standard fighter sweeps were proving completely useless. The United States Air Force possessed the F-4 Phantom II, a heavily armed twin-engine interceptor built explicitly for air-to-air combat. But when the Air Force sent formations of F-4 Phantom II fighters ahead of the bombers to clear the skies, the North Vietnamese ground controllers simply watched them approach. The radar operators easily recognized the distinct altitude profiles, the faster cruising speeds, and the unique radar signatures of the Phantom formations. Seeing that the approaching aircraft were highly capable fighters looking for a fight, the controllers issued a simple order: keep the MiGs on the ground. The Phantoms would circle the empty sky, burn through their fuel reserves, and eventually return to base. Then, the next day, when the radar screens showed the heavy, vulnerable signatures of the bombers returning, the MiGs would launch again. The United States Air Force was caught in a tactical stalemate. They possessed absolute technological superiority, but they were bleeding aircraft because they could not force the enemy into an engagement on equal terms. This was the broken operational environment that Colonel Robin Olds inherited when he assumed command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in September of 1966. Olds was a severe anomaly within the increasingly bureaucratic structure of the jet-age Air Force. He was a veteran fighter ace from the Second World War, a tactician who fundamentally believed that the primary purpose of a fighter wing was to eliminate the enemy in the air, not to manage spreadsheets or passively absorb political directives. When Olds arrived at the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, he found a unit operating under a cloud of strategic exhaustion. Morale was strained. The pilots were flying the F-4 Phantom II, yet they were largely relegated to acting as passive escorts for the bombers, forced to weave back and forth to stay behind the slower strike packages, burning precious fuel and waiting to be ambushed. Olds recognized immediately that the systemic failure in the air campaign was not an issue of pilot skill or aircraft performance. It was a failure of imagination. Olds and his planning staff, including veteran tacticians like Major John Stone, isolated the tactical variables. They knew Washington was not going to reverse the rules of engagement. The political sanctuaries protecting the North Vietnamese air bases were permanent fixtures of the war. They also knew that the North Vietnamese ground control intercept network was highly disciplined. The enemy would never commit their elite MiG-21 interceptors unless the radar screens explicitly confirmed that the incoming American aircraft were vulnerable F-105 bombers. But this rigid enemy discipline presented a theoretical vulnerability. The entire North Vietnamese aerial defense apparatus relied entirely on what the radar operators believed to be true. The MiG pilots in the cockpit made no independent decisions. They blindly trusted the vectors given to them by the controllers in the bunkers. If the controllers told the pilots they were intercepting heavy, sluggish bombers, the pilots would adjust their tactics, speed, and mindset to hunt bombers. Olds looked at this dynamic and formulated a seemingly impossible mandate. If the United States Air Force was forbidden from destroying the enemy airframes on the concrete, they had to pull the entire interceptor fleet into the sky and eliminate them simultaneously. But to do that, they had to offer the North Vietnamese ground controllers a target so irresistible, so electronically perfect, that the enemy command structure would abandon its caution and launch every available fighter they had. The objective was clear, but the engineering reality of achieving it was staggering. Olds realized that he had to take a fleet of agile, deadly F-4 Phantom II interceptors and completely disguise them. He had to erase their true identity and engineer a massive aerial illusion. Every single data point that the enemy radar network collected, the flight paths, the refueling points over the Gulf of Tonkin, the specific altitudes, the airspeed, and the highly distinct electronic jamming signatures, had to precisely mimic the very F-105 bombers the enemy loved to hunt. It was an unprecedented requirement. The Wolfpack was going to dress its deadliest wolves in sheep's clothing and fly them directly into the center of the enemy's radar net. But as the operations officers at Ubon began drafting the classified parameters of what would become Operation Bolo, they immediately ran into a severe technological wall. Changing flight paths and radio chatter was a matter of pilot discipline. But altering the physical radar reflection of an entire wing of aircraft required hardware that the fighters simply did not possess. The entire deception relied on the enemy radar operators seeing a specific piece of electronic equipment. If Olds could not find a way to rapidly and clandestinely re-engineer the Phantom airframes to carry bomber-specific technology, the best radar operators in Southeast Asia would instantly see through the mirage. To understand the absolute audacity of the trap being assembled at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in late 1966, You have to discard the modern understanding of aerial warfare. Today, a fighter jet is packed with high-resolution digital sensors, data links, and optical targeting systems that provide a crystal clear picture of the battlefield. But the air war over Southeast Asia was an analog environment. When a North Vietnamese ground control intercept operator sat in a bunker scanning the skies over the Red River Delta, he was not looking at a live video feed. He was looking at a glowing cathode ray tube. He was analyzing abstract shapes, tracking raw radar energy bouncing off metal objects hundreds of kilometers away. A radar array does not see an airplane. It sees a cross-section of reflected radio waves. It calculates speed, it measures altitude, it registers the specific geometry of a flight formation. Colonel Robin Olds and his planning staff understood that to the North Vietnamese radar operators, reality was strictly defined by these glowing green data points. If you could manipulate those specific data points, you could manufacture a completely false reality. You could make a pack of heavily armed F-4 Phantom II interceptors look exactly like a vulnerable formation of F-105 bombers. But engineering this electronic mirage required solving a massive hardware problem. The centerpiece of the entire deception was a highly specialized piece of equipment known as the QRC-160 electronic countermeasures pod. By 1966, the heavy F-105 Thunderchief bombers had begun carrying these pods on their external wing pylons to survive the dense rings of Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles protecting the Delta. The QRC-160 was an active jammer. When activated, it flooded the surrounding airspace with localized radio frequency noise, blinding the missile tracking radars. However, this defensive jamming came with a massive tactical trade-off. While the pod degraded the ability of a missile to lock onto an individual aircraft, the sheer volume of electronic noise it broadcast acted like a massive glowing beacon for the enemy early warning radar networks. The North Vietnamese ground controllers had quickly learned a fundamental rule. When their radar screens filled up with a specific fuzzy electronic interference generated by a QRC-160 pod, it meant only one thing. The vulnerable F-105 bombers had arrived. If Olds wanted to bait the enemy into launching their elite MiG-21 interceptors, his F-4 Phantom II fighters had to broadcast this exact same electronic beacon. There was just one severe institutional hurdle. The fighter squadrons were not authorized to carry the jamming pods. The Air Force supply chain had allocated the highly classified QRC-160 pods exclusively to the bomber wings. To get his hands on the equipment, Olds had to orchestrate a quiet logistical shell game. Bypassing standard bureaucratic channels, he and his staff managed to quietly siphon dozens of the jamming pods from other bases across Thailand, funneling them into the maintenance hangars at Ubon. Procuring the hardware was only the first step. Mounting them onto the aircraft was an entirely different engineering nightmare. The F-4 Phantom II was a thoroughly complex, heavily wired airframe built strictly for air-to-air combat and fleet defense. It was not pre-wired to integrate bomber-specific electronic countermeasures. The maintenance crews at Ubon were forced to work around the clock in absolute secrecy, pulling panels, rerouting internal electrical buses, and fabricating custom mounts. They had to adapt the right outboard wing pylons of the Phantoms to securely hold the heavy, drag-inducing pods. Think about the physical reality of this modification. An aircraft is a delicately balanced aerodynamic machine. Slapping a bulky, asymmetrical pod onto one wing drastically alters the drag profile and handling characteristics of the fighter, especially at the high speeds required for air-to-air combat. The crews had to ensure that the internal wiring could feed sufficient power to the pod without shorting out the Phantom's own complex internal fire control radar, all while maintaining the strict operational secrecy required to prevent enemy intelligence from realizing the fighter wing was reconfiguring its loadouts. As the frantic mechanical modifications neared completion in the final days of December, the planning staff turned their attention to the behavioral engineering of the deception. Hardware alone would not be enough. The North Vietnamese ground controllers were deeply analytical, highly trained technicians. They monitored flight profiles just as closely as they monitored radar signatures. To complete the illusion, the Phantom pilots had to fundamentally abandon their fighter instincts. A standard F-105 bomber formation flew at specific, predictable speeds, usually around 450 knots, optimized for fuel efficiency while carrying thousands of kilograms of ordnance. F-4 Phantom II interceptors typically operated at higher altitudes and faster cruising speeds. To mimic the bombers, the Phantom pilots had to throttle back and fly low, adopting the exact heavy lift profiles of the aircraft they were impersonating. More critically, they had to change their spatial geometry. To maximize the effectiveness of the QRC-160 pods, the bomber pilots flew in tight, rigid four-ship formations. This specific spacing allowed the electronic jamming cones from each individual pod to overlap, creating a massive, impenetrable wall of static on the enemy radar scopes. Fighter pilots, by contrast, preferred loose, fluid formations that allowed them to check their 6 o'clock positions and maintain high-energy maneuverability. For Operation Bolo, Olds demanded absolute discipline. The Phantoms would fly in tight, restrictive bomber pods. They would surrender their tactical flexibility to perfectly trace the shape of the bait. The routing was equally meticulous. The strike package would not take a direct, unpredictable vector into enemy airspace. Instead, they would deliberately fly the exact ingress routes used by the bombers. They would hit the same specific aerial refueling tracks over the Gulf of Tonkin in northern Laos, taking on fuel from the KC-135 tankers at the precise coordinates and altitudes the enemy expected. Even the radio chatter had to be sanitized. North Vietnamese intelligence units actively monitored American radio frequencies, listening for any auditory clues regarding the composition of incoming strike packages. Fighter pilots used entirely different tactical jargon than bomber crews. If a ground controller heard a pilot calling out aggressive tactical sweeps or utilizing F-4 specific call signs, the deception would collapse instantly. The Wolfpack pilots were ordered to observe strict radio discipline. They adopted standard bomber terminology. They used F-105 route check-ins. They flew under traditional bomber call signs like Ford, Rambler, and Olds. By the evening of January 1st, 1967, the trap was fully constructed. The mechanical retrofits were complete. The flight paths were locked. The radio discipline was briefed. Operation Bolo was primed. On the morning of January 2nd, the massive, heavily disguised strike force began rolling down the concrete at Ubon. The operational sequence was a masterpiece of timing. To completely mimic a full-scale bombing raid, the operation required multiple staggered waves of aircraft. First, the primary strike flights of F-4 Phantom II fighters, loaded exclusively with air-to-air missiles and the critical jamming pods, launched toward the refueling tracks. They were supported by a complex, highly synchronized ballet of secondary aircraft. Iron Hand flights equipped with anti-radiation missiles flew ahead to suppress surface-to-air missile sites. RC-135 electronic reconnaissance aircraft orbited at the absolute edge of enemy airspace, monitoring the North Vietnamese radar frequencies to ensure the enemy controllers were actually taking the bait. As the Phantoms pushed off the tankers and turned their noses toward the Red River Delta, a severe meteorological variable threatened to alter the physics of the entire operation. A massive, unseasonal weather front had settled over North Vietnam. The sky over the target area was blanketed by a dense, solid layer of undercast clouds, with tops reaching nearly 2,000 meters. For a traditional bombing mission, this heavy cloud cover would have forced an immediate abort, as the bombers required visual identification of their ground targets. But Operation Bolo was not a bombing mission. The target was the enemy air force itself. In fact, the heavy weather played perfectly into the psychology of the deception. Because the North Vietnamese ground controllers could not visually confirm the incoming aircraft through the thick clouds, they were forced to rely with absolute, unwavering trust on their radar scopes. As the tight, slow-moving formations of Phantoms crossed into hostile airspace, they flipped the switches on the QRC-160 pods. Instantly, massive walls of electronic noise began broadcasting across the enemy's early warning frequencies. The Phantoms held their rigid bomber spacing. They maintained their sluggish airspeed. They utilized their bomber call signs. Deep inside the underground bunkers at Phuc Yen, the cathode ray screens lit up exactly as Olds had anticipated. The North Vietnamese radar operators stared at the data. The speed was correct. The altitude was correct. The electronic jamming signature was flawless. All the mathematics pointed to a massive, highly vulnerable formation of heavy bombers, lumbering blindly over the cloud deck. The trap had been meticulously engineered. The bait had been cast perfectly into the electronic void. The only question remaining was whether the elite enemy controllers would issue the order to launch their interceptors, sending their finest pilots up through the dense cloud layer into an airspace filled not with helpless bombers, but with the deadliest air-to-air hardware the United States possessed. Deep inside the subterranean command center surrounding Pakyan Air Base on the afternoon of January 2nd, 1967, the glowing green sweeps of the North Vietnamese early warning radar screens painted exactly what the local ground controllers desperately wanted to see. The incoming telemetry was unambiguous. Slow-moving heavy formations were pushing out of the west, flying at an altitude and heading that perfectly matched standard American strike packages. The electronic interference bleeding across the cathode ray tubes was the undeniable signature of the American defensive jamming pods. To the senior technicians managing the ground control intercept network, the tactical mathematics were solved. The vulnerable American bombers had returned, completely blind to the fact that they were walking into a heavily fortified airspace. The controllers calculated the intercept geometry, finalized the intercept vectors, and issued the launch order to the alert pads. At the air bases below, elite North Vietnamese pilots scrambled into the cockpits of their Soviet-supplied MiG-21 interceptors. The Tamansky R-11 turbojets spooled up, generating a massive wall of thrust that pushed the lightweight Delta Wing fighters down the runway. As the interceptors lifted off the concrete, they immediately pitched their noses up and vanished into a dense, gray void. The unseasonal weather front that had settled over the Red River Delta was severe. A solid, impenetrable undercast layer of cloud stretched from a few hundred meters above the ground all the way up to an altitude of roughly 2,000 meters. Flying through this thick atmospheric soup, the MiG pilots had zero external visibility. They were entirely dependent on their cockpit instruments to maintain spatial orientation and completely reliant on the radio voices of the controllers in the bunkers below to guide them toward their targets. This total reliance on external command vectors was a cornerstone of their defensive doctrine, but on this specific afternoon, it was the exact mechanism that pulled them into the trap. Above the 2,000-meter cloud deck, the sky was a brilliant, clear blue. Here, the American strike package held its nerve. The F-4 Phantom II pilots, operating under strict radio silence and maintaining their sluggish, rigidly compressed formations, watched their radar warning receivers. They knew the electronic bait was floating out across the enemy frequencies. They also knew that to maintain the illusion, they had to remain perfectly in character until the absolute final second. They had to sit in the sky, heavy and slow, while the enemy interceptors climbed directly toward their blind spots from the gray abyss below. Then, the tactical reality of the airspace inverted in an instant. The first flights of MiG-21 interceptors punched through the top of the cloud deck, erupting into the clear air directly beneath the American formations. The North Vietnamese pilots snapped their heads around, scanning the airspace to visually acquire the massive, elongated silhouettes of the heavily laden bombers their controllers had promised them. Instead, they found themselves staring at the distinct, menacing dihedral-winged profiles of F-4 Phantom II interceptors. There were no heavy bomb racks. There were no sluggish, overloaded airframes struggling to maneuver. The aircraft bracketing them were clean, highly aggressive fighter platforms, optimized purely for air-to-air combat, and their pilots were already breaking formation to initiate the merge. Consider the immediate psychological and organizational shock of this exact moment. The entire North Vietnamese aerial defense structure was built on rigid, top-down control. The pilot in the cockpit executed the math, calculated by the technician in the bunker. But as the F-4 Phantom II fighters violently shed their external drop tanks and accelerated into combat maneuvering, that centralized command structure instantly collapsed. Down in the subterranean bunkers, the radar operators were still looking at glowing blips that insisted the targets were heavy, slow bombers. The electronic jamming pods on the Phantoms were still broadcasting the fake signatures. But up in the clear blue sky, the MiG pilots were screaming over the radio that they were surrounded by advanced American fighter interceptors. The telemetry on the ground directly contradicted the visual reality in the air. Faced with this massive information paradox, the ground controllers could not provide coherent tactical adjustments. They began broadcasting frantic, overlapping, and contradictory vectors. The highly disciplined Soviet-style intercept doctrine shattered under the weight of the deception, leaving the individual MiG-21 pilots completely isolated, forced to improvise against superior American numbers in a chaotic, rapidly deteriorating visual arena. The trap was successfully sprung. The elite enemy fighter force was finally in the sky, exactly where the American tacticians wanted them. But springing an ambush and actually neutralizing the target are two entirely different engineering challenges. As the engagement immediately devolved into a furious, high-speed turning fight, The massive 2,000-meter thick cloud layer that had perfectly concealed the Phantom's identity suddenly became the greatest threat to the operation. The MiG-21 was a remarkably agile aircraft, built for rapid acceleration and sudden directional changes. As the North Vietnamese pilots realized the sheer scale of the tactical disadvantage they had flown into, their immediate instinct was self-preservation. They did not need to outrun the American Phantoms all the way back to their air bases. They only needed to point their noses down. The solid gray floor of the undercast was sitting just beneath the dogfight. If a MiG pilot could roll inverted, pull back on the stick, and dive for merely 3 to 4 seconds, he would punch right back into the dense weather system. Once inside those clouds, visual tracking was impossible. An American pilot could not blindly pursue a diving enemy fighter into a zero-visibility environment without risking a catastrophic, fatal collision with the terrain below or with another aircraft. The cloud deck was an absolute sanctuary. This geographic reality put immense, crushing pressure on the American pilots and their onboard hardware. To achieve a tactical elimination, they had to intercept the target, maneuver into a highly specific firing geometry, acquire a definitive weapon lock, and guide the munition to the intercept point, all before the panicked enemy pilot could dive into the clouds. They had a window of mere seconds to execute an incredibly complex mechanical sequence. And this is where we must look closely at the physical capabilities of the F-4 Phantom II during this specific era of military aviation. Unlike the fighters of previous generations, the F-4 Phantom II was engineered under the assumption that the era of close-range, visual dogfighting was over. Consequently, the aircraft was designed without an internal cannon. An American pilot could not simply pull the trigger and saturate the airspace ahead of him with high explosive projectiles. Every single tactical elimination had to be achieved through guided missile technology. The primary weapons integrated into the airframe were the AIM-7 Sparrow and the AIM-9 Sidewinder. To the aerospace engineers drawing up blueprints back in the United States, these missiles represented the absolute pinnacle of defensive technology. But a sterile testing environment over a desert range in Nevada cannot replicate the brutal, chaotic physics of a low-altitude dogfight over Southeast Asia. To fire the AIM-7 Sparrow, the F-4 pilot and his radar intercept officer in the back seat had to point the nose of their aircraft at the enemy, utilize their onboard continuous wave radar illuminator to paint the target with a tight beam of radio frequency energy, and then hold the target inside that beam for the entire duration of the missile's flight path. If the targeted MiG violently broke its flight path, or if the Phantom pilot was forced to maneuver defensively and lost the radar lock, the Sparrow would immediately lose guidance and fall dead through the sky. The AIM-9 Sidewinder offered a fire-and-forget capability, utilizing a highly sensitive infrared seeker head in the nose of the missile to track the heat signature of the enemy's engine exhaust. But the seeker technology of 1967 was incredibly fragile. The pilot had to maneuver directly behind the enemy aircraft, wait for the seeker head to cool down, listen for a specific auditory tone in his headset confirming a lock on the exhaust plume, and fire. If the enemy pilot turned sharply, or if the missile's seeker head accidentally locked onto a bright reflection from the cloud deck below, the weapon would veer off wildly into the void. Both of these advanced systems relied entirely on complex arrays of fragile internal vacuum tubes, analog wiring harnesses, and sensitive gyroscopes. As the sky over Phuoc Yen filled with twisting, accelerating aircraft pulling massive G-forces, the American pilots began squeezing their triggers. The electronic mirage had done exactly what it was designed to do, delivering the enemy on a silver platter. But as the heavy F-4 fighters attempted to close the final link in the kill chain, an entirely new, deeply alarming mechanical reality began to assert itself. The tactical brilliance of the deception was about to be stress-tested against the glaring engineering limitations of the very munitions the United States military had staked its entire aerial dominance upon. As the first formations of enemy fighters snapped into tight defensive turns above the Red River Delta, the American pilots immediately squeezed their triggers. The meticulously engineered electronic trap had worked perfectly, placing the United States Air Force in an unassailable tactical position. But over the next 12 minutes, the engagement would transform from a masterclass in aerial deception into a severe, highly frustrating stress test of American military hardware. To fully grasp the reality of what happened in the skies over Phuoc Yen, we have to look closely at the fundamental design philosophy of the aircraft involved. The F-4 Phantom II was originally conceived by aerospace engineers as a pure interceptor, built around the rigid doctrine of beyond visual range combat. The theoretical expectation during the design phase was that a pilot would detect a hostile target on radar dozens of kilometers away, fire a guided munition, and turn away long before the enemy even realized they were under attack. Consequently, the massive twin-engine fighter was engineered without an internal cannon. Every single tactical elimination relied entirely on complex missile technology. But Colonel Robin Olds had intentionally forced a completely different operational dynamic. Operation Bolo dragged the enemy into a close-range, visual turning fight. The American pilots were maneuvering heavily, pulling immense G-forces and trying to secure radar locks in a chaotic, swirling environment for which their primary weapons were never truly designed. The AIM-7 Sparrow was the heaviest and theoretically most capable air-to-air munition in the American inventory. It was a semi-active radar homing missile. To utilize it, the radar intercept officer sitting in the back seat of the F-4 Phantom II had to acquire the enemy aircraft on the radar scope and switch to a continuous wave illumination mode. This effectively painted the target with a tight, concentrated beam of radio frequency energy. The receiver inside the nose of the Sparrow would track the reflection of that specific beam all the way to the point of impact. When the pilot pressed the firing button, an incredibly violent mechanical sequence initiated. An explosive cartridge fired, forcefully ejecting the 200-kilogram missile downward off the wing pylon to clear the airframe. A fraction of a second later, the solid-state rocket motor ignited, producing a massive spike in acceleration. Inside the guidance section of the missile sat a highly intricate array of complex electronics. In 1967, solid-state transistors were not yet the standard for military applications. The logic boards and guidance modules of the Sparrow relied heavily on fragile analog vacuum tube technology. These tubes consisted of delicate glass enclosures, sensitive heated filaments, and precise internal wiring. Now, consider the sheer physical violence of the environment. You are taking a complex analog radio receiver, strapping it to a powerful rocket motor, and violently ejecting it from a heavy aircraft, pulling intense structural loads in a steep turn. You are expecting those fragile glass vacuum tubes to survive massive, sudden acceleration, power up instantly, and perfectly process a faint radar reflection bouncing off an agile, highly maneuverable MiG-21. The physics of the environment were fundamentally incompatible with the hardware. American pilots established perfect intercept geometries. They held the enemy securely within their radar sights. They received the correct auditory tones in their headsets, confirming weapon readiness. And they fired. And then the hardware failed. Dozens of missiles simply dropped cleanly off the rails, only for their rocket motors to remain completely dormant, leaving the heavy, multi-million-dollar munitions to fall dead into the heavy cloud deck below. Other Sparrows successfully ignited and accelerated, but the immense G-forces instantly shattered the internal vacuum tubes. Without guidance logic, the missiles immediately went ballistic, veering off wildly into the empty sky. Even when a missile managed to survive the launch sequence and track the target perfectly, an entirely different engineering flaw frequently surfaced. The AIM-7 Sparrow did not rely on a direct physical impact to neutralize a target. It utilized a complex, continuous rod, high-explosive warhead, triggered by an advanced radar proximity fuse. As the missile passed within a few meters of the enemy jet, the proximity fuse was supposed to detect the metal airframe and detonate, projecting an expanding ring of steel that would slice through the hostile aircraft. But during the extreme maneuvering of the dogfight, these fuses repeatedly failed to arm or trigger. American pilots watched in deep frustration as their Sparrows flew absolutely perfect trajectories, passing mere centimeters from the enemy canopies, only to sail harmlessly off into the distance without detonating. Look at this exact dynamic from the perspective of an operational fighter pilot. You have taken an immense strategic risk. You have flown deep into a heavily defended airspace disguised as a vulnerable bomber. You have completely dismantled the enemy command structure through sheer behavioral engineering. You have successfully outmaneuvered a lighter, more agile interceptor. The target is locked, but the absolute pinnacle of American aerospace manufacturing simply refuses to function. Frustrated by the rampant unreliability of the radar-guided munitions, many of the F-4 Phantom II pilots quickly abandoned the Sparrow and switched to their secondary weapon system, the AIM-9 Sidewinder. The Sidewinder was a fire-and-forget heat-seeking missile. It utilized a sensitive, uncooled, lead, sulfide infrared seeker head mounted directly in the nose of the weapon. To employ it, the pilot had to maneuver directly behind the exhaust plume of the enemy aircraft, wait for the seeker head to cool down, and listen for a distinct, high-pitched growl in the headset, confirming an infrared lock. But the meteorological realities of Operation Bolo actively subverted the technology. The entire dogfight was taking place just meters above a brilliant solid white layer of undercast clouds. The intense, unseasonal Southeast Asian sun was reflecting sharply off the heavy water vapor. The early generation infrared seeker heads of the 1960s were not sophisticated enough to filter out this massive level of background thermal clutter. Pilots aggressively hauled their heavy fighters into tight pursuit curves, secured the required auditory tone, and fired their sidewinders. In many instances, the moment the missile left the rail, the seeker head was immediately distracted by the bright reflection of the sun on the cloud deck. The munition would break its lock on the enemy exhaust plume and aggressively dive directly into the weather system below. Over the course of the intense 12-minute engagement, the operational statistics generated a deeply alarming picture. The American flights fired an incredibly high volume of highly advanced air-to-air missiles. The overwhelming majority of them failed completely. They failed to guide, they failed to fuse, or they simply failed to leave the aircraft. Yet, the sheer tactical brilliance of the bait and switch deception ultimately overrode the abysmal mechanical reliability of the ordnance. The North Vietnamese interceptor pilots were completely isolated, deprived of the rigid, stabilizing guidance of their ground control intercept network. They found themselves critically outnumbered by highly aggressive American crews who refused to surrender the offensive advantage. The F-4 Phantom II possessed massive dual J-79 turbojets, providing an immense thrust advantage in the vertical plane. When a missile failed, the American pilots simply used their raw engine power to pull up, retain their kinetic energy, reposition, establish a new lock, and fire again. They utilized the sheer volume of their carried ordnance to brute force their way through the technological failures. By the time the surviving enemy fighters finally recognized the complete collapse of their defensive strategy and desperately dove back into the impenetrable safety of the cloud layer, the airspace fell completely silent. The operational mathematics of the engagement were permanently altered. 7 elite MiG-21 interceptors were confirmed neutralized. The primary North Vietnamese fighter wing had been thoroughly dismantled, representing a catastrophic blow to their operational inventory and a complete humiliation of their defensive doctrine. As Colonel Robin Olds and the heavily armed Phantom formations reformed their flights, checked their fuel states, and turned west to begin the long transit back toward their bases in Thailand, they verified their own status. 0. Not a single American airframe had been lost. Not a single pilot was missing. They had flown directly into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, sprang an unprecedented trap, and executed a flawless tactical sweep. When the aircraft landed at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, the immediate response was one of absolute operational vindication. The mechanics on the flight line counted the empty weapon pylons and painted 7 red kill markers on the noses of the returning fighters. The Wolf Pack had solved the impossible political puzzle handed down by Washington. But thousands of kilometers away, deep inside the data analysis centers at the Pentagon, technicians and military engineers began compiling the raw telemetry, the maintenance records, and the pilot debriefs from the mission. The numbers they extracted from the data were stark, unavoidable, and deeply troubling. The ratio of missiles fired to targets neutralized exposed a massive systemic failure in the primary weapon systems upon which the entire future of American air superiority rested. The military establishment now faced a critical institutional crossroads. They possessed undeniable proof of a glaring technological crisis inside their arsenal. Would the leadership in Washington recognize the data, halt the procurement lines, and initiate a massive, immediate engineering overhaul of their failing munitions? Or would the dazzling, perfectly executed tactical triumph of Robin Olds' historic deception provide exactly the excuse the bureaucracy needed to sweep the alarming hardware anomalies quietly under the rug? When the raw intelligence data, the debriefing transcripts, and the gun camera telemetry from the afternoon of January 2, 1967, finally reached the analysis desks in Saigon and Washington, the strategic shockwave was absolute. The United States Air Force had just executed a masterstroke of behavioral engineering. But what happened in the days and months immediately following the trap reveals a complex, often contradictory story about how military institutions process success and failure simultaneously. Over the Red River Delta, the enemy command structure was entirely paralyzed. The loss of 7 elite MiG-21 interceptors in a single 12-minute engagement was not merely a severe tactical setback. It represented the systemic elimination of nearly half of their operational frontline interceptor inventory. Declassified post-action assessments and intercepted communications confirmed that the North Vietnamese High Command issued an immediate, sweeping directive. They grounded their entire remaining fighter fleet. For months following the ambush, the skies over the northern operational zones were largely devoid of hostile fighter activity. They had to completely deconstruct the failure of their ground control intercept network. The Soviet-supplied doctrine, which relied on rigid, centralized command from subterranean bunkers, had been thoroughly manipulated. The North Vietnamese intelligence officers had to sit down with their radar technicians and analyze exactly how they had been fooled by the American electronic warfare hardware. They realized they could no longer simply trust the glowing electronic interference on their cathode ray screens. They began retraining their operators to look for minute discrepancies in radar cross-sections, to study the subtle variations in cruising speeds between heavy bombers and advanced fighters, and to fundamentally question the data their own equipment was feeding them. The entire defensive apparatus of North Vietnam was forced into a massive top-down doctrinal overhaul. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away in the sterile, heavily guarded offices of the Pentagon, weapons evaluation boards were pulling apart the firing logs from the returning American squadrons. This is where the narrative of a flawless operational triumph begins to heavily fracture. Behind closed doors, military engineers and defense contractors began compiling the raw mathematics of the engagement. The numbers extracted from the pilot debriefs were stark, unavoidable, and deeply alarming. To achieve those 7 tactical eliminations, the American flights had ripple-fired an astonishing volume of ordnance into the skies over Phuoc Yen. Dozens of highly expensive, supposedly state-of-the-art guided munitions had been expended. The ratio of missiles fired to targets successfully neutralized was abysmal. The data proved unequivocally that the AIM-7 Sparrow and the AIM-9 Sidewinder were failing at a catastrophic rate. Consider the massive disconnect between the aerospace engineers in the United States and the operational pilots flying the combat missions. When the Pentagon analysts looked at the failed missile telemetry, their initial institutional reflex was to blame the operators. The engineers argued that the F-4 Phantom II pilots had squeezed their triggers outside the strictly defined kinematic envelopes of the weapons. They pointed to the technical manuals. The Sparrow was designed to be fired at a non-maneuvering target from long range. The Sidewinder was designed to be fired against a steady heat source with minimal background clutter. To the engineers, sitting at desks in Washington, the hardware was perfectly fine. The pilots were simply using it incorrectly. But the pilots returning to the debriefing rooms at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base fiercely pushed back against this sterile laboratory logic. They argued that the theoretical kinematic envelope simply does not exist in a real, chaotic low-altitude turning fight. When a pilot is pulling heavy structural G-forces, attempting to outmaneuver an agile delta-wing interceptor just meters above a blinding white cloud deck, they do not have the luxury of waiting for the absolute perfect radar geometry. They fire when they have the operational advantage. The pilots exposed a hard engineering truth. The complex, fragile vacuum tubes encased inside the missile guidance sections were fundamentally incompatible with the extreme acceleration and violent structural loads of visual air combat. The proximity fuses were mechanically unreliable under high-stress conditions. The infrared seeker heads were easily overwhelmed by simple solar reflections bouncing off the weather systems below. This massive hardware crisis forced the United States military establishment to a critical institutional crossroads. They possessed undeniable, hard empirical evidence of a glaring technological failure deeply embedded within their primary weapon systems. The logical, albeit highly painful response would have been to halt the procurement lines, openly acknowledge the engineering deficiencies, and initiate a massive, immediate redesign of their air-to-air munitions. They needed solid-state electronics capable of surviving the violence of a dogfight. They needed robust fusing mechanisms. They needed internal cannons retrofitted to the interceptor airframes to provide pilots with a reliable secondary option. But large institutions rarely admit multi-billion-dollar mistakes when they are simultaneously handed a highly visible victory. The Department of Defense chose to focus entirely on the scoreboard. The operation was heavily publicized as an unprecedented operational triumph. The tactical brilliance of the deception provided exactly the narrative cover the bureaucracy needed to sweep the alarming hardware anomalies quietly under the rug. Colonel Robin Olds had proven that American ingenuity and sheer pilot aggression could overcome the impossible political restrictions imposed by Washington. Medals were pinned to chests, commendations were filed. The official press briefings championed the absolute superiority of the F-4 Phantom II platform and its advanced weapon systems. Think deeply about the hidden danger of this specific institutional response. What happens when a critically flawed engineering system achieves a massive, undeniable success through unconventional means? You generate a severe internal blindness. The defense establishment convinced itself that the 7 confirmed eliminations validated the beyond visual range missile technology, conveniently ignoring the fact that those eliminations were achieved entirely through a close-range, visual-turning fight orchestrated by a maverick tactician. They celebrated the tactical alchemy while completely ignoring the volatile chemistry of the munitions themselves. By failing to address the glaring engineering data exposed during the engagement, the military establishment inadvertently set the stage for years of grueling, highly costly aerial engagements. Colonel Olds had performed an absolute masterclass in behavioral manipulation, but you cannot permanently engineer your way out of a systemic hardware failure. The North Vietnamese ground controllers eventually completed their doctrinal overhauls. They adapted to the electronic signatures. They revised their intercept profiles. When the enemy interceptors eventually returned to the skies over the Red River Delta in the spring of 1967, they refused to fall for the same electronic mirage twice. The tactical window for massive, sweeping aerial ambushes had firmly closed. Consequently, the American pilots were sent back into the hostile airspace flying the exact same airframes, armed with the exact same fragile vacuum tube missiles, under the exact same restrictive political directives from Washington. The mechanical deficiencies that were masked by the sheer brilliance of the deception would go largely unaddressed until the heavy mounting operational losses of the late 1960s and early 1970s finally forced the creation of specialized combat training programs and aggressive, highly expensive hardware redesigns. While the operation firmly stands as the absolute pinnacle of aerial bait and switch tactics, a masterpiece of logistical coordination and behavioral engineering, military historians and defense analysts continue to debate a profound, unresolved institutional question. Did the dazzling, historic success of Operation Bolo inadvertently delay the critical engineering overhauls and doctrinal reforms that the United States military desperately needed to secure absolute air supremacy in the punishing years that followed?